The name's Veronica, she'd often say, as if to remind herself who she was amidst the clamor of life. It wasn't that she was antisocial, she liked people well enough, it's just that she was never the type who needed constant company to feel fulfilled. Her mother, always perceptive, recognized this independent streak early on. Instead of trying to change her, she channeled it into something productive. When Veronica was barely tall enough to reach the kitchen counter, her mother introduced her to the world of cooking. It wasn't just about making meals. It was an education in the art of food. They would visit local cafes and restaurants, and her mother would break down the flavors of every dish they sampled. Over time, Veronica's fascination with food grew beyond taste. She became obsessed with presentation, ambience, and the stories that food could tell. One day, as a teenager, she turned to her mother and said, "I want to write about food." There was a glint of pride in her mother's eyes. "Then you better learn everything there is to know about it, kiddo." Veronica enrolled in a culinary institute right after high school, determined to master the culinary arts. But she didn't stop there. She took journalism courses, learning how to craft words the way a chef would craft a meal. Her dream was to write restaurant reviews that allowed people to taste the food through her descriptions. Her first gig was for a small local paper, writing about a cozy Italian restaurant. She described the way the homemade pasta melted in her mouth, how the rich aroma of garlic and basil transported her to a Tuscan kitchen. To her surprise, the article was a hit. "You've got a gift," her editor told her. "Keep this up, and you'll go far." And far she went. Veronica began writing for larger publications, building a reputation for her honest, witty reviews. But the real turning point came when she started her own social media page. Suddenly, she was no longer just a critic for magazines, she was connecting directly with food lovers all over the world. It was just another Tuesday evening when she found herself at the Rustic Spoon, a new farm-to-table joint she was reviewing. As she jotted down notes about the ambience, an elderly couple at the next table caught her eye. The woman whispered to her husband while glancing at Veronica. Used to being recognized, Veronica smiled politely and returned to her notes. A moment later, the woman spoke up. "Excuse me, you're Veronica Miller, right? The food critic?" "That's me," Veronica replied with a nod. The woman's eyes lit up. "Oh, I'm such a fan. Would you like to join us for dinner?" Normally, Veronica preferred to dine alone while working. But something about the woman's genuine enthusiasm made her reconsider. She accepted the invitation. Moving to their table, the woman introduced herself as Martha, her husband as George, and their son Jack, who up until that point had been absorbed in his phone. The evening passed pleasantly. Martha and George were eager to hear about Veronica's travels, while Jack, with his lopsided grin, added witty comments that made her laugh. As the night went on, Veronica found herself enjoying Jack's company more than she expected. When it was time to leave, Jack hesitated. "Would it be okay if I got your number?" he asked. "You know, for restaurant recommendations." Veronica felt a flutter in her stomach. "Sure," she said, hearing herself agree. For restaurant recommendations. It didn't take long for their conversations to move beyond food. Soon, they were texting about everything. Their chats became the highlight of Veronica's day. And a month later, Jack asked her out on a proper date. She said yes without hesitation. There was an easy comfort between them. None of the awkwardness she usually felt on first dates. A year after they met, Jack proposed. It wasn't a grand gesture, he knew that wasn't Veronica's style. Instead, he cooked her dinner, though his effort resulted in slightly charred steak and lumpy mashed potatoes. He asked her to marry him over dessert. Veronica couldn't say no. They moved into her apartment after the wedding and set up a joint account for shared expenses. Given her higher income, Veronica contributed more, but both felt it was fair. Living together revealed new sides of Jack. He had a habit of leaving dishes in the sink, uncapping the toothpaste, and scattering coffee mugs around the apartment. It irritated her at first, but she bit her tongue, reminding herself that no one was perfect. Eventually, they found their rhythm. 6 months later, they planned their first vacation together. Veronica had been eagerly looking forward to some private time together after months of being busy with work. However, when they stood at the airport, her excitement turned to disappointment as she saw Martha and George approaching, beaming as if they were an essential part of the trip. We couldn't let you two have all the fun. Could we? Martha exclaimed, full of unrestrained excitement, pulling Jack into a hug and smiling at Veronica as if this was the most natural thing in the world. Veronica forced a smile, but inside, she was furious. This wasn't part of the plan. She glanced at Jack, expecting a reasonable explanation, but he only mumbled something about a family tradition and looked down. Avoiding her gaze, Veronica felt betrayed, but she didn't want to ruin the trip from the start. Telling herself she could handle it, she clenched her teeth and tried to suppress the growing frustration. As the trip progressed, things only got worse. Veronica noticed how freely Martha and George spent money, shopping like there was no tomorrow, dining at the fanciest restaurants, and never worrying about the bill. Despite trying to enjoy the vacation, Veronica couldn't shake the nagging feeling about how irresponsibly the money was being spent. She could no longer ignore it. When they returned home, Veronica immediately checked their joint account. Shock and fury overtook her as she saw how much of their savings had been drained. The money they had worked so hard to save for bigger goals in life was nearly gone. Jack, care to explain this? She asked, her voice tight as she struggled to maintain her composure. Jack's face immediately paled when he saw the figures on the screen. I might have used our account to cover some of my parents' expenses, he admitted quietly, his voice full of guilt. Veronica felt her anger erupt. She had worked so hard to earn every cent, and this was how Jack handled their finances. Jack, that was our money. You should have discussed this with me first. You know I've contributed most of the money to this account, don't you? She couldn't believe he had done this after promising they would build their life together. Jack hung his head, his voice small like a child being scolded. I know, I'm sorry, it won't happen again, I promise. But Veronica wasn't easily soothed by empty promises. Her trust had been eroded, and she felt the growing instability in their relationship. This wasn't just about a ruined trip, it was a sign of a much deeper problem. A month passed, and life gradually returned to normal. Jack kept his promise, not touching the joint account without discussing it with Veronica first. And she tried to forget the embarrassing incident. But her trust was no longer intact. A lingering anxiety clung to her whenever she thought about their relationship with his family. When Jack suggested another trip for just the two of us, Veronica tried to remain hopeful. Maybe this time, things would be different, but her worries became reality when, just as they finished packing, Martha and George showed up again, as radiant as ever, and completely uninvited. Veronica stood frozen, anger boiling inside her. Jack, she said, her voice low and restrained. Your parents can't just barge into our lives like this. We need to set boundaries. And you need to talk to them. Jack only nodded weakly, promising to take care of it. But a few days later, Martha and George appeared at their apartment once more, completely unfazed. This time, they had a new goal in mind. Veronica, Martha said nonchalantly as if nothing had happened. We need your advice on the best restaurants. And who knows, maybe we can score a free meal thanks to your reputation. Right? Veronica's patience had run out. She had tried to let it go, but now it was too much. Martha, this needs to stop, she said firmly, but Martha merely chuckled, oblivious to the seriousness of Veronica's warning. Things came to a head when Martha and George showed up, uninvited, at a restaurant where Veronica was conducting a review. In front of the stunned customers and staff, Martha loudly declared, "We're Veronica Miller's in-laws, the famous food critic. Of course, we're here to enjoy a free meal." Veronica felt her face burn with embarrassment. The patrons began to turn their heads, and the servers awkwardly hesitated, unsure of what to do. Martha sat down casually, completely unaware of the gravity of the situation. "Martha," Veronica whispered, her voice trembling with restraint. "You can't do this. I'm working. This is serious." But Martha only laughed louder, further escalating the awkwardness. "Oh, don't be shy, dear. Everyone knows food critics eat for free. Why can't your family enjoy those perks too?" Veronica stood rigid, her anger reaching its peak. "Martha, if you don't leave right now, I will call security." Her eyes were cold, and her voice no longer carried its usual calm. "You're interfering with my job and causing a scene." Martha, now realizing that Veronica was no longer playing nice, glared at her with indignation. "I can't believe this. Is this how you treat family? I'm the one who told Jack he should marry you. I thought a successful woman like you would help us live a better life. But it seems I was wrong." Veronica said nothing, only watching as Martha and George stood up and stormed out. Angry and humiliated, the restaurant fell into an eerie silence, with all eyes now on Veronica. She couldn't continue, her hands shaking. She took out her phone and called Jack. "Jack," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Your mom just told me that she pushed you to marry me because she thought I would provide for them. Is that true?" There was a long silence on the other end before Jack sighed. "Yes," he admitted, his voice full of regret. "Mom thought I should marry you because of your career. But Ronnie, I really do love you. Not because of that." Veronica felt like her whole world was collapsing. All the promises, all the talks about building a future together, now felt like lies. A few months later, Veronica's cookbook was published to rave reviews. Jack planned a surprise trip to celebrate, assuring her that it would just be the two of them. But when they arrived at the train station, Martha and George were there once again. Veronica couldn't take it anymore. She stepped off the train, called a cab, and left without looking back. The next few days were a blur as she filed for divorce, blocked Jack's access to their accounts, and packed his belongings. When Jack returned home, he begged for another chance. But Veronica stood firm. "This isn't just about your parents. It's about trust, respect, and the life I want to live. We want different things, and that's okay. But I can't do this anymore." In the months that followed, Veronica rediscovered herself. She threw herself into her work, found solace in the kitchen, and learned to enjoy the quiet moments alone again. Life hadn't turned out the way she planned, but maybe it had turned out exactly as it should. She was Veronica again, food critic, author, and, most importantly, the mistress of her own destiny.